It stops here. It stops here? That's the name of the park and memorial located in the southern city of Ashdod. Well, really the name is in Hebrew, Ad Halom, which translates to It Stops Here. This park/memorial commemorates a decisive battle that changed the course of the Israeli War of Independence. It was a must-win, the last line of defense to stop the enemy forces, hence the name. On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion declared the establishment of the State of Israel. The next day, this new state was invaded by 5 armies. The largest was the Egyptians. They had a 2-pronged goal: capture Tel Aviv and capture Yerushalayim. This, of course, would quickly be the demise of the new state. To accomplish their goal, the Egyptians divided their forces into 2. The first went up the coast. The second went from Beersheba towards Yerushalayim. Miraculously, both efforts failed, but only after fierce and brave efforts put up by the Israelis. Ad Halom is located on the Lachish riverbed. Today, it is usually a dry riverbed, but even today, after a heavy rainfall, this could once again become a proper rushing river with the water fed from the Hebron Mountains feeding into the Mediterranean. However, a long time ago, when there was more rainfall, this was truly a river. Back in the 13th century, this country was ruled by the Mamluks. They built a bridge over their river as part of their postal route. It was later reinforced by the Ottomans in the late 19th century. The British added a railway bridge in March of 1917 during World War I to connect Egypt to Palestine. During the British Mandate, a pillbox was added next to the bridge during the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939. For the Egyptians to reach Tel Aviv, they would have to traverse this bridge. The Israelis understood full well that to stop the Egyptian advance to Tel Aviv, their troops would have to be stopped here at all costs. If they succeeded in passing here, there would be nothing to stand in their way to complete their goal, and the state would be lost. Blowing up the bridge was a must. The Israelis decided blowing up the bridge was so urgent that it needed to be done even before the British vacated the country. But how? There were British guards in the nearby pillbox. A daring plan evolved. 2 soldiers from the Givati Brigade, 53rd Battalion, arranged it to acquire the necessary 300 kilograms of explosives. They went to a nearby kibbutz to get mules to carry the explosives. But the soldiers weren't farmers, and they had no idea how to handle mules. So the mules fled, and the soldiers had to schlep the explosives by themselves. Under the cover of night, very close to the British pillbox, the 2 Givati soldiers planted the explosives under the bridge. However, it failed to detonate. Understanding the seriousness of the mission, one of the soldiers went to repair the charger. This attempt succeeded, and it exploded the bridge, but the soldier was injured in the process. 2 weeks later, on May 29th, thousands of Egyptian soldiers with their 500 armored vehicles and tanks arrived at the bridgeless river. While they were calculating how to navigate this river, suddenly 4 airplanes appeared overhead. This was a game changer of this battle. The Egyptians were shocked that Israel had an air force. In fact, the previous day, Israel did not have an air force. Due to the urgency to halt the Egyptian advance, the previous night of May 28th, 4 World War II surplus aircraft, which arrived from Czechoslovakia, were hastily unloaded and assembled. These planes were comprised of surplus World War II parts. They had never been flown to see if they were battle-ready. They were flown by 4 pilots. One was Ezra Weizmann, who would later become the commander of the Israeli Air Force and the president of Israel. And there were 3 Machal volunteers from abroad. Truth be told, they weren't particularly effective. A number of cannons and machine guns jammed, and only a few rounds were actually inflicting minimal damage. Unfortunately, one plane was downed and the pilot was killed. The fact that Israel had an air force, as inefficient as it was, the psychological impact on the Egyptians was enormous. They scattered in all directions and they lost momentum of their attack. Meanwhile, the Givati Brigade was given the order to attack the Egyptian forces on the night between June 1st and June 2nd. However, it was aborted due to an impending ceasefire. The ceasefire didn't materialize, and the attack was postponed to the following night of June 2nd to June 3rd. However, the Egyptians discovered the plan, and the element of surprise was gone. The Egyptians were prepared to battle the Israelis. The Israelis began their attack with an artillery barrage, but it was ineffective. All it really accomplished was to alert the Egyptians that the Israelis were battling. The army had committed a relatively small number of soldiers to participate in this attack. Many were untrained, inexperienced, and lightly armed. They were up against the Egyptian army, consisting of between 2,000 to 3,000 regularly trained soldiers with tremendous backup support. 3 Israeli companies set out to assault the Egyptians from various locations. One tried to attack from the west, but they encountered difficulty crossing a wadi. One company attempted a frontal assault, but they stepped into an ambush. They managed to counterattack, but many were wounded, and so they retreated. Another company attempted a frontal assault from the other side with limited success. They also decided to retreat after taking many casualties. In all, 54 soldiers were killed in this attack. This attack was known as Operation Pleshet, and it was riddled with difficulties from the beginning. The mules fled before reaching their destination. The explosive charges by the bridge initially failed to detonate. The impending ceasefire caused a delay in the assault, causing a blow to the morale. It also eliminated the element of surprise. The Air Force attack was basically ineffective. The troops were inexperienced and they took heavy casualties. With all this, one would think that this was a major flop. But the opposite is true. Many positive outcomes resulted from this battle. The main one being that they halted the Egyptian advance. The Egyptians concluded they were stretched out too thin and their supply line was too far. Therefore, they could not proceed northward. Their losses were at least double of those of the Israelis' casualties. The appearance of the 4 airplanes had a tremendous psychological effect on the Egyptians, who had assumed that the Israelis didn't have advanced weaponry and that they would be pushovers. And by the time the ceasefire did come into effect, the Egyptians had failed to capture any territory which had been designated by the UN for the Israelis. Today, Ad Halom is a park and a memorial to those who fought valiantly and sacrificed their lives. There are plaques dedicated to the fallen. One special plaque is dedicated honoring the Machal pilots who were overseas volunteers and comprised most of the beginning of the Israeli Air Force. It is dedicated in particular to Eddie Cohn, a South African who was the Air Force's first casualty when his plane was downed here. After the 1979 Camp David Accords, an Egyptian memorial was erected here to commemorate the Egyptian losses. This is one of 2 such memorials in Israel. The bridge at Ad Halom has been reconstructed in the original Mamluk architecture. Today it is used by pedestrians and cyclists. Recently, the government has allocated funds for the rehabilitation of the natural surroundings of the site to integrate environmental conservation with the site's historical context. This site has been symbolically named Ad Halom, it stops here, to epitomize Israel's resolve and determination against existential threats. It was here that the Israeli forces quickly mobilized as a new army to offset a much larger, better trained, and well-equipped army. It was here that the Egyptians discovered that the Israelis had an air force and that they couldn't underestimate Israel's abilities. And it was here that the threat to Israel's coastline was thwarted. This bridge became the emblem of Israel's spirit to endure against all odds.